All right. Well, it's good to have everybody here this evening. I'm glad to have a chance to share some stuff, and I hope it's useful for you again. Um, we're going to start off with the conversation on what is God's master plan, just to kind of re-emphasize that, since that's part of our main theme.
Sounds good.
Did you hear it?
Yeah, we're good.
So what is God's master plan?
There's a question. Sorry.
Sorry.
To fill the earth with His glory, right?
Yeah. And again, we'll bring it up every time. There's a lot of stuff that points to it. And you remember we talked about, just as an emphasizing point, the whole wheel structure, right? The hub, the spokes, and the outside wheel. Did anybody remember what those three things relate to as a kind of a metaphor?
Everything points back to God.
That's right. The outside wheel is the master plan, right? So I just use it as a metaphor. I think about the hub as like the story. The spokes are the elements of the story, but all the elements are, we can call them sub-stories, always connect back to the master plan of God. So every time we get into a conversation in the scriptures about an event in history, it's going to connect you in some way back to the master plan of God. And I should say that with a different emphasis. It's going to connect you in some way to the master plan of God. And it's important to recognize that. So when you talk about what the Bible is and what the Bible is not, it's important to be real clear. So I'm going to ask a question kind of as something to bounce, to get us thinking in the space. Does anybody remember the story about Jesus calming the waves of the Sea of Galilee?
Yeah, we actually had a class on that last week.
Okay. So, and this is kind of a great place to have a conversation to demonstrate what the Bible is not. How did Jesus calm the waves?
He spoke to them. He said, "Be still."
Precisely. He spoke to the waves and told them to be still. Now explain to me the mechanism, the mechanics behind that. I have no idea. I mean, if you know, tell me, please. I take it on faith. I believe absolutely that it's a real account, that Jesus spoke to the waves, that he was witnessed by the disciples, and that the waves calmed immediately. I'm comfortable that all of those things are factual. How did Jesus' words calm the waves? No idea. Bible isn't there to explain the way, the mechanics. We just trust that the mechanics are valid. So whatever mechanics God uses to accomplish those things, the Bible is not in place to explain the mechanics. But if you wanted to talk about the Bible and discussion on stormy winds fulfilling God's word, and the Revelation accounts of the stormy waters representing the nations in unrest and without peace, and then talk about the waters being at unrest and Jesus' word bringing peace, I could quickly describe to you that Jesus' physical event has a metaphoric value, that without the word of Jesus, there will be no peace in the nations. The reason, the reference of the verses, the history that's brought up, is because there's another story behind it that's very important to us. If we just walked away knowing that Jesus spoke to the waters and they were calmed, well, that's good. But it isn't the message. It's the story that begins to reveal the message. And I want to go back to the conversation in the Bible. We know that the wheel is about everything, every element of the story that we're going to look at connects in some way to God's master plan. But it isn't a general connection. It's a specific one. And this is something I may have talked about briefly in the first class, but I want to kind of touch on it again and just bring it to your attention. The Bible is not a history book. Even John in chapter 21 makes point that if everything Jesus did was written, that the books would fill the earth. The Bible, the four Gospels don't describe to us everything that happened with Jesus. But what they do describe then is important because there's a very specific purpose with what's revealed or what's shared to us. So when you get in the conversation about the story of Adam, it's not just a history lesson about God's creation of Adam. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
The story of Adam is about something else. It's important because it introduces Adam and Eve in the beginning of the plan, but it's more than that. The story of Adam and Eve connects us to God's master plan, both the creation aspect of it when he tells us what the plan is, and how they fell from obedience, but then how God deals with them and how he recovers them, and how the plan is still being progressed, and what they learned are the same lessons we have to learn. And so when we get into the conversation on Abraham and Lot, which is today's class, we pay attention. Now, there's a lot of text, and we could read all the text, and that would take most of our time. But I'm going to really just point you to the text. It starts in Genesis chapter 12. And I want to bring out some highlights in the text. And it would really benefit everybody that's in the class if at some point in this week, after the class, if you go back and read Genesis 12 all the way through Genesis 19 and look at the different things that are given, because the story is just touched on in several parts. And when you pay attention to those details and put them together, you see that there's another story. And there's a story about Abraham. So I want to talk about three things, and really three different stories, and they kind of intertwine. So it's difficult to just talk about one story without getting into the others. But there's a story about Abraham, or Abram as he starts off. And James tells us that Abram is a righteous man, right? James 2:23, and if you were to look at that, it tells you that he was a righteous man. But Abram is a man of promise, and there's a developmental story starting at Genesis 12 and working its way forward. But when I think of Abram, my natural inclination is to think of, there was this guy, and he was amazing, and he left his country, and he had faith in God, and he was prepared to sacrifice his child. And when I think of all that, I kind of think of it in one bullet. It all is kind of this impression of Abraham in my view. And then as I went back and started studying more, I began to realize that there's a lot more to the story. And a lot of that story is given in the way it's given for you and for me. Because if I look at the faithfulness of Abraham, I think there is no way. There's no way that I'm ever going to come close to that. That, all of this belief in God all at one time. But then you look at the story, and there's more to the story than meets the eye, and God is giving it to us because He's telling us about how how the process of faith is developed in you. It's not something that you receive and you have. It's something that grows. And you aren't always just right, but that's okay because God's working with us, and it's over a period of time. I want to talk a little bit about how God keeps promises, because also in this particular account of Abram, you get promises given, and we can talk briefly about that. But you also have promises kept. Now, there are the promises of Abraham, but we're not going to talk about the full resolution of the promises of Abraham. That continues on into our future when the kingdom is established. But there's some very specific things that God has asked of Abraham, and we're going to look at that. And we're going to look at how it unfolds and how it finally is received by Abraham, and what the criteria are. So we're going to look at that briefly, because it's interesting to see that, again, God is waiting patiently. It's not something that God says, go to the grocery store, and Abraham went to the grocery store and it was done. It's far more drawn out than that. And I think for me that also brings hope, because I see that God has a very real promise for us. But it's not about you did one thing and you got one thing. It's not tit for tat. It's not like that. It works differently. And Abraham is the beginning, an early conversation on how God works with us. And then the third thing in the focus stories, and you have this in your focus story part, is the importance of the story of Lot and his time in Sodom and how he came to be there. There's the story itself, and there's some really peculiar elements to the story and surrounding the story, and it ties back up to Abram and him being a man of faith, and it ties into how God's keeping promises. But it also talks about Lot in particular and life decisions, and very important life decisions, and how he ends up where he ends up, because that is really directly about you and me, right? Lot's experiencing something, and God is showing us where the decisions Lot made. We need to be very thoughtful about the kind of decisions we make, because we can end up in a really bad place if we make really bad decisions. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. So those are the three things that we're going to talk about, plus any direction you end up taking me, because I can be spastic in my conversations. So I love the Bible, and I will go on tangents if you let me. So we're going to begin. Now, I want to start off with, before I start, first of all, does that all make sense where we're going with today's conversation?
Yes.
Okay. So let's start. Let's read Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3. Somebody please read that.
The Lord had said to Abram, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you."
Perfect. Now, I started off on the first class, and I think I repeated it in the second class. I'm going to repeat it again. Detail is critical. Okay? Detail is critical. So I wouldn't ask you to read all 1,800 pages at one time and pay attention to every detail. That would be all-consuming and would never succeed. But for 3 verses, I want you to look at the first verse, and God doesn't start off with a promise. He starts off with an instruction. And if somebody will point out, how many elements of instruction does God give Abraham, and what are they?
Leave your country and go to a land.
That's 2 of 3.
Well, and your father's household, but that kind of seems like the same thing as leaving your country.
So I think in one part he says, leave your family, leave your country, your family, and go to a place I will show you, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So pay close attention. 3 elements of instruction, and they're in order. He says, first I want you to leave your country, then I want you to leave your family, and then I want you to go to a place that I'm going to show you. In other words, don't find a good place to go live and go there. He says, I'm going to lead you there. I'm going to take you there. It's not about what you want. It's about what I want. And Abraham, and then he says, and if you do this, right? That's kind of the silent if, right? He says, and this is what will happen. I'll make you a blessing. Those who bless you will be blessed. Those who curse you will be cursed. He says that all the nations of the earth will be blessed through you. Is that an intermediate step, or is that a final step?
Final step.
Yeah. Well, right now, some of the nations aren't being blessed, right? And that's because the final step, eventually, ultimately, all that remain will be those who are in the faith of Abraham, and they will all be blessed, because that's the plan of God. And what you see is, when you're used to looking at the plan of God, the master plan of God, you always see those things that pop out, because the detail is that the ultimate state, the ultimate reality, when everything is said and done, is that all of those who dwell in the family of God will all be part of the family of Abraham, right? They'll all be part of receiving the blessings of Abraham and the promises of Abraham, and they will dwell with God in the kingdom on the earth, as God promised Abraham. Now, this is the early part of the promises. The promises are restated several times, and then they're carried through the rest of the scriptures, right? But right here at the beginning, he tells them, this is what I have for you, right? Leave your nation, leave your family, and then go to a place I will show you. And so follow me as I lead you to the end destination. And here's kind of the temporary state of things. If you're, those who bless you will be blessed, those who curse you will be cursed, and there's a lot of expansion on that. But the ultimate state is, it's just going to be your family who becomes my family, and the whole earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Now, I read all that in there because I know that that's the ultimate state, and that's the implication of that statement. In the end, all the nations of the earth will be blessed through you. Right? So, right there where you have those 3 or 4 lines, what was Abram requested to do by God? That's where you want to put it. So we're going to kind of go into the story a little bit. I'm not going to just go through the lines here. So we know that, and I'm happy for feedback on this, but we know that that's the beginning, right? So Abraham leaves his country, right? And so he leaves Ur of the Chaldees. And does anybody know where he goes?
He goes to Haran, right?
Yeah, that's actually the name of his dad, which is really interesting. So he leaves Ur of the Chaldees, but his family goes with him, and they end up in a place that later is named Haran. And when does Abram leave Haran?
Well, verse 4 says he was 75 years old when he left there.
Uh-huh. And we know that he left with Lot, and we know that he left Haran after his father died.
Right.
So the very beginning, when you get in verse 1 of chapter 12, right, the first thing God tells Abram to do is what?
Leave your country, leave your family, and go to the land I'll show you.
That's right. So we know he leaves his country and goes to a new place, right? But then he stops and he settles with his family. And then his father dies and he leaves Haran. And who does he leave with? Lot. So how many of the 3 elements does Abram follow from the beginning?
2 of them, right? The first and the third? Or just the first?
Well, yeah, you don't know about the third yet because Abram doesn't end up. The first one, he ends up in Haran. Has he gone to the land that God is going to show him?
No, that would be Canaan later.
Right. It's not until he ends up in Canaan. And I think there's several things we can see where we'll all see the progression that he goes into. So it's interesting to see that then he picks up with Lot. So he still hasn't done the second one yet. And then he moves again and he goes into the land. Now let's go ahead and turn to Genesis 13 and read the first 14 verses. And let's just have 2 people read the first 7 verses and the last 7 verses.
So Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev with his wife and everything he had, and Lot went with him. Abram had become very wealthy in livestock and in silver and gold. From the Negev he went from place to place until he came to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had been earlier, and where he had first built an altar. There Abram called on the name of the Lord. Now Lot, who was moving about with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. But the land could not support them while they stayed together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to stay together. And quarreling arose between Abram's herdsmen and the herdsmen of Lot. The Canaanites and Perizzites were also living in the land at this time.
So Abram said to Lot, "Please let there be no strife between you and me, nor between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brothers. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If to the left, then I will go to the right. If to the right, then I will go to the left." Lot lifted up his eyes and saw all the valley of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as you go to Zoar. So Lot chose for himself all the valley of Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled in the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked exceedingly, and sinners against the Lord. The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, now lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward.
Very good. So here's a couple of questions, and you have it on your document. But it's an interesting story because first they end up in the land of promise, but then there's a famine, and then they have to go to Egypt, and there's a whole story with Abram and his wife Sarai at that time, and then they come back after that, after basically the Pharaoh tells them to get out because he felt like he was betrayed, and they come back to the land of promise. But Lot's gone with them through this whole conversation. So the story doesn't really talk about Lot until you get back in chapter 13. But it's clear that Lot has been following Abram through the entire sequence of events. So there's no part in the story so far where Abram has separated himself from his extended family. So Lot's gone with him the whole time. So the question I have, and we just read this, is what is the reason that now they're going to separate or part ways?
Because they're too numerous.
Yeah, for the land to support them, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so you get this comment that's made in Genesis 13. It says he has too many camels, too many sheep, and too many tents. Now, we know the camels and sheep are about livestock, and the land has to support them, and there just wasn't enough land for everything they had. But what's the implication of having too many tents?
Well, it's people.
Yeah, people. So he's got a lot of people with him, right? And we aren't told who the people are. We just told that they do have a lot of people. And we know that there's a conflict between the shepherds, so there's a number of shepherds involved, right? And so the conversation says, well, let's not let anything come between us. Let's kill the strife, and the way to do that is we have to go our own separate ways. Now this is interesting because a series of events unfolds that allows for a peaceful resolution that also drives Lot and Abraham to separate. But here's the question. Sorry, shouldn't look at the phone. So at this point in time, Abraham's already received promises from God. He's already received instruction. And what would you expect about Abraham's spiritual person, about him as a person spiritually? What would you expect?
Well, if you've just been entrusted with promises, I would feel pretty good. Pretty good about myself.
Yeah. Right? There's something specific about Abraham that God has selected, God has picked out. And Abraham is already living in righteousness. But he's not perfect. Right?
Right.
I mean, you know that because what we didn't read at the end of chapter 12 was telling Pharaoh that Sarai is his wife because he was afraid that he would die. And yet we know that God has already begun the conversation that he would end up with a large family. So he hasn't translated God's promise of a large family to he's going to protect me from kings and whatever needs to be protected. So he hasn't necessarily internalized what God has given him. And you know what? I have things that I haven't internalized that God has given, and I'm sure every one of us have read things in the Bible that we know are true, but at some level, it isn't part of our obvious reality. It's something we have to keep thinking about and reminding ourselves of. And I see that in Abraham in chapter 12 to chapter 13. He's ready to believe in God, but it doesn't necessarily translate into every element of his life. And that's why he fears Pharaoh, because he hasn't internalized the full impact and implication of God's promises to him. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, we see a difference. We're not going to go there, but let me skip forward to the conversation on Isaac. And when God tells Abraham to take Isaac to this place and to make an offering of him. Hebrews tells us what the mindset of Abraham is, and that's in chapter 11 of Hebrews, and you can write that down. And it's interesting that in chapter 11 it tells us that Abraham considered God faithful in his promises, and that he knew that since his descendancy was going to be realized through Isaac, that if Isaac was put to death, God would have to raise him from death. So he didn't just blindly go forward to kill his son. He knew that God's promises were true, and that if God asked him to kill Isaac, that Isaac would come back to life. He knew it, because he knew that was the way that God would have to go because of the promises God made. And that's what I mean. At this point in his life, he is fully internalized. He thinks through what God is telling him. He understands the implications of the promises. And if God tells him to do something that's impossible, he still gets it. He's still applying the spiritual truth of the promises in his life, and he's living by them. And that is another story which we aren't going to cover today, even though I may have just done it. So I want to share that with you. Early in the study, he hasn't applied the implication of the promises God has given into his daily walk in every way, maybe in a lot of ways. But we're given an example that he's not there in every way, right? But we know that he's a righteous man because he believes God. He just hasn't internalized all of the message. And I find that an interesting message of hope. So when you see that, that shows that God doesn't require perfection to begin working with us. And that's a great message, right? And that's one I carry away. I think, well, that's good. Because if he did, I wouldn't be here, right? So there's another interesting conversation that happens here. And this is, I think, tied to the faith. So, God said that you leave your family. Now, he's been tied to his family for a long time. This isn't a year or two after they leave. He left when he was 75 years. He left out of Haran. He probably got the promise a little bit before that, maybe at 70 years, right? So they had moved out of Ur, after he was asked to follow God. He left and lived in Haran for a while. Then he moved out of Haran. He's 75 years old. And that's important because we're going to talk a little bit about it. And now he's gone to the promised land, which he had to walk to, and it's quite a distance. And then he went from the promised land to Egypt, which is a long way off to walk. And then he walked back from Egypt back to the promised land. You're not talking 2 years, right? This is probably closer to 8, 9, 10 years. We're getting in that time frame, right? So this is quite a long time. So he's been with Lot for a long time. But now it's time to part ways. And I find this is, you don't hear any conversation about them trying to figure out how to stay together. Rather, you hear conversation about them that are ready to separate and they're ready to go their own ways. But what's the implication? I mean, it's Abraham who's the primary spiritual leader, right? Do y'all follow that? It's Abraham who's the primary spiritual leader. Is it Lot that's leading the spiritual, or is it Abraham? Seems to be Abraham, right? All the spiritual conversation so far is about Abraham. It's really not about Lot. Lot's following with Abraham's family because Abraham has taken Lot and his family and his extended family under his wings. So you get that Abraham is the spiritual head. And so Abraham proposes to Lot, you choose. Now, what's the significance of this? What does it suggest about Abraham?
He's humble.
He's humble, absolutely. Why are they in the promised land in the first place?
Because Abraham listened to God?
Because Abraham listened to God, right? So they're not there because Lot wants to be there. They're there because Abraham is following God and Lot is being held under the wings of Abraham, right? So here's Abraham. He's going to his promised land, to the promised land for him and his seed, and he looks to Lot and he says, okay, you choose. What is Abraham anticipating
Right. Yeah, I have a friend who's a lawyer, and he says a good lawyer never asks a question that he doesn't know the answer to. So I think he knew. He knew what Lot was going to say.
That certainly could be. So what's the implication then?
Well, that he wanted Lot to go to, place X, and so that he could go to Canaan.
Yeah. Well, and that's one. There's another thought, and it has to do with watching spiritual. So I don't know if we've talked about John 3 before, but it's an interesting thing because Jesus manifests something in his discussion with Nicodemus. It's quite interesting. So when you get to about John 3:11, John 3:12, in that range, Jesus starts talking to Nicodemus about the Spirit is like the wind. It comes from someplace and it goes to someplace, and you don't know where it's coming from, and you don't know where it's going. It seems like a very difficult conversation in the English, but from a idiomatic standpoint, Jesus is creating a metaphor between those who live by the Spirit and how the wind is. And his conversation with Nicodemus is really like this. I can't ally myself to you because you have a very specific set of rules and processes and ways that you operate. And I'm going to be led by the Spirit. I don't know where it's leading me. And tomorrow where it leads me may come in conflict with any kind of alliance I have with men. Therefore, I have to choose whether to be allied to God or whether I'm going to be allied to man. And he goes on with the conversation. It's quite an interesting discussion because there's a lot of things that are inferred in the discussion that aren't overtly spoken. But that's the conversation he's having with Nicodemus. The point I make by that is if you're going to live by the Spirit, you don't know what it's going to tell you in advance, right? And so that means as spiritual people, we always have to be on the lookout for where God wants us to go, right? And if I tell God where God should want me to go, it's backwards. God, that's not how God works, right? God says, do you have an open heart? Do you have an open mind? Are you listening to me? Because if you are, I will direct your paths. And here's an interesting thing. Abram has been led to the land, but God hasn't settled him. He's still nomadic. And you still see that through most of the rest of the conversation of Abraham's life, he remains nomadic. And that's because God continues to lead him and he continues to listen, but he never really settles because he doesn't receive the promises in his day, right? At least not the promises in a complete way. There are some things he's promised which he very definitely receives, but we're going to talk about that here in a second. So what I would suggest to you is it's the beginning of the glimpse of Abraham not choosing where he is going to end up because he knows he wants to leave it in the hands of God. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So what I'm saying is Abraham knows that whatever Lot chooses, that God's behind it. He's removing the choice from himself because he knows that the decision needs to be in God's hands, and he trusts God to lead him in the right direction. And here's the thing. Does Lot take the worst land, or does he take the best land?
Best.
Yeah. He takes the best, the well-watered valley. It's got communities of people which represent safety and security. I mean, they've already come out of safety and security when they came out of Ur. He can have crops. He can have flocks. It's just well provided for. He's got the perfect place to go, right? And when they're standing there and Abraham is saying, which way do you want to go? Abraham probably knew that was the best land. But Abraham knew that the question of faith is about that third thing he was asked to do, right? Leave your country, leave your family, go where I'm going to show you. Don't go where the best land is. That's not what God said. He said, follow me. And so if he hadn't had specific instruction from God, then what he's anticipating is that any decisions that happen from Lot are part of the conversation. He's just accepting that as part of the influence of God in his life. And he's good with that. And it's very different from how we operate. Before I'm going to move to a land, I first go look at it. I decide if I can afford it. I pick it out, and then I pray to God that he blesses me in the land I purchased. See where that's backwards?
Yeah.
Yeah, see that? That's backward. Abraham's not going to do that at all. So anyway, I find that instructive that that's the way Abraham goes about it. He doesn't go after the best land. I mean, he's the one that was brought here. In the mind of a lot of people, well, yeah, but this was the promise you're giving to me, and you drew me into this land, and I'm going to take the best because you're giving it to me and my family. And Abraham is completely opposite of that. You choose, Lot. You choose. And whichever way you go, I'll go the other way. I'm going to leave this in. And when he's leaving it in Lot's hands, he's not. He's leaving it in God's hands. Now I'm going to ask a question. Now we know the well-watered plain is in the region of Sodom, and Lot's looking at the land. What if you're looking at the best land? What are you thinking? What's the benefit of moving there?
Well, I guess it's the best place to raise.
Best place to raise what?
Well, I guess I'm thinking in the horses, we want to go to some place that has lots of pasture. And I'm assuming
Absolutely.
Similar back then.
Yep. The crazy dogs are barking at the grasshoppers again. So you got great pasture. So your flocks will have great pasture. They'll multiply. Your relative wealth will go up. Right. You won't be hunting for food. You'll have plenty of food. If you have any family, one of the things you look for is a community of peoples, right? You don't want your son marrying your daughter. You want other options, right? I mean, I'm in Arkansas. That's a different conversation. But anywhere else in the world, right? That's not good. So there's a combination of criteria that he's probably checking off, and he's like, wow, this is a great place to go. But does his choice pay off?
Well, his city's destroyed a couple years later. So.
Yeah, utter destruction. And so it also seems everything that he owned, I mean, his flocks, there's no mention of any more flocks. There's, he loses part of his family and maybe more than we let on at first. So I would say no. It seemed an obvious choice in the beginning, but there were some criteria in his decision-making that he missed entirely. And I think that's part of the story we're going to go into. So, again, I will bring these up here in a minute. So you look at it, and sometimes the obvious choice is the very wrong choice. And we need to take that as a spiritual lesson. The obvious choice is not always the right choice. And Abraham makes no choice at all, leaves things in the hands of God, and he ends up in a better place. He ends up protected. He ends up getting to follow God some more into another place. And we're going to look at that. So let us look at Genesis 18. And we'll go ahead and turn there. We're going to look at 16 through 19 and 19:27. But before we go there, I'm going to set the scene for the story, because now we're going to get to another interesting story. And so far, we've talked a little bit about the evidence of Abraham and the way he's approaching things in his life and his spirituality, which we'll take lesson from as we conclude. I'll share some of that, some of my conclusions. And we'll also share the conclusions on how God works in revealing or finishing promises and that type of thing. But we're going to enter into the conversation now a little bit about Lot and the evidence around Lot. So the conversation is that the angels come into the presence of Abram and Sarah, and they basically are reaffirming in chapter 18, they're reaffirming the promises that are going to be realized by Abram. And Abram basically tells him, he says, well, yeah, this is all great. I'm going to have this huge family, but I don't even have a child. And at this point, who am I going to do it, through? Is it going to be one of my servants? And they're like, no, this time next year you will have a child. Now, we know he's got Abraham, Isaac, Isaac and Esau.
Ishmael.
Ishmael, that's right. I was thinking Esau. That's wrong. Ishmael. So he knows Ishmael's around. As a matter of fact, when Abram was 85 years old, he ended up with a son through Hagar that was Ishmael. So we know now that Abram says that, the angels tell him, no, you're going to have a son. This time next year, you will have a son, which is an interesting prognosis. So, and I'm going to bring up a little point here in a second, but the interesting thing, Abraham makes a response that, well, when I'm 99 and my wife is 90 years old, now we're going to be given this pleasure. Well, that means Ishmael's 14 years old. And keep in mind that Abram was given the promise. We know he left Haran at 75. And we know that he left Ur of the Chaldees before that and lived for some time in Haran. So let's say 70. So how many years are we looking from the time that Abram is told that he will be made a great nation to the time that he's told it will happen by the next year? How many years? If we just start with 70 as the starting point, how many years?
Let's call it 30.
Yeah, call it 30. So it's interesting that you've got effectively approximately around the area of about 30 years from the time that God first told Abram, go and do these three things, and I will give you this outcome, to the time that the outcome actually happens. So two things. It speaks to the progression of Abram following God, and it speaks to faith and the development of faith. Because it isn't something that Abraham believed and happened. It's something that Abraham stuck with for 30 years and progressively got to the point of following and obeying God until he finally did all the things God asked, and then he saw the outcome that he'd been promised, right? And so that talks to me about the development of faith in us, because it's not like God said, I love you and I have good stuff for you, and it should be in the paycheck next week. That's just not how God works. He's going to challenge us to live differently, and it's going to take us time to sort it out. But he's not going to leave us. He's going to stick with us through the entire process. And when we get to there's no end to the process. But when we learn to have greater faith in God, then we see him in his interactions with us. It's paired. It's joined up. But it's not just, I believe today and suddenly everything works out perfectly. That's just not the way it works out. And we see that in Abraham. And he's counted as a man of great faith and the one through whom the promises rest. And yet it took him 30 years to finally get to this point. So let's talk a little bit about, I should stop for a second. Does that make sense? And are there any questions before we progress to the story of Lot?
Makes sense.
Makes sense?
Yes.
Nothing too confusing yet?
Yeah.
Okay, story of Lot. Now I'm going to paraphrase a couple of because there's like a zillion verses here. But the angels are with Abram. They've just told him that he's going to have a child. He's just gone through the whole conversation. Sarah's laughed. They tell her that, why are you laughing? Don't you have faith? Don't you believe us? And then they say, and we're going to name the child Isaac, which, funny enough, means to laugh. And then they go to Abram and they have the conversation in Genesis 18. So somebody read verse 16 through 19 for me.
Then the men rose up from there and looked down towards Sodom, and Abraham was walking with them to send them off. The Lord said, Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do, since Abraham will surely become a great and mighty nation, and in him all the nations of the earth will be blessed? For I have chosen him, so that he may command his children and his household after him, to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring upon Abraham what he has spoken about him.
Now, it's funny because if you pay really close attention to those verses, there's an echo there. And what's the echo? What are they alluding back to, or what are they referring back to?
The promise is that he's going to become a great nation.
Absolutely. And what do they say about him and his family and his children?
Well, they'll follow in his footsteps in terms of worshiping God.
Yeah. And I want to tell you that I think this is recorded because something's about to happen that's going to affect Abraham, and they don't want to leave him out of it. They're delivering a message. They're connecting the idea of how he's going to train his family in the ways of the Lord, and how this whole conversation that's about to take place is that conversation. It's about you love God, you have faith in God, you're a recipient of the promises. It's not just you having faith. You're going to be an example to your children, and you're going to lead them in the ways of the Lord. And since this is all true about you, are we going to leave you out of the story of what's about to happen? And I think what we're hearing from the angels and in the record is that this is actually an introduction to a contrast. And the contrast is between two people, right? And the first person is Abraham. You want to guess who the second person is?
Lot.
Let's try Lot. Right? The second person is Lot. Because something is happening. Now, Abraham, pardon me?
Nothing, just a cough.
Just a cough, sorry.
Oh, yeah, I have those too. Sorry about that. So Abraham is going to have a conversation with the angels. So the angels then turn around to Abraham and they say, here's what's going to happen. The outcry against Lot has been so great that we're going to go down there and we're going to check it out. And if we find what we think we're going to find, we're going to wipe out the city. Now, how does that affect Abraham?
Well, his brother's, or nephew's there.
Yeah, nephew whom he's spent a substantial amount of his life protecting has chosen the well-watered valley. It says that Lot set up his tent next to the city of Sodom, right? But now, if destruction is going to occur to Sodom, it's not just going to be Sodom, right? And we actually know there's another story where there's a confederacy of kings. They took they fought against the confederacy of the kings from the local region, and the king of Gomorrah and the king of Sodom and their confederation lost, and Sodom had this other confederation come in and take all their people, and Lot was with them. So what we find out is Lot eventually migrated from his tent on the outskirts of the city into the city itself. Now, part of this story we didn't talk about was the part where Abraham took his righteous men and went and fought the confederacy and overthrew them, and got all the people of Sodom back, and all the booty that was gained out of Sodom, got it all back, saved Lot, brought them all back, didn't give them back to the king of Sodom, but held on to them, and then met the king of Sodom at a neutral meeting ground. And the king of Sodom tells Abraham, give me the people back. Here's the deal. If you just let me have the people back, you can keep all the bounty, right? And we'll call it good. That's your reward for fighting. And Abraham basically tells him, and think about this, I've raised my hand to God and sworn that I will receive nothing from you, not even the shoelace of my shoes, right? Not even the strap of my sandal. I will in no way be enriched by you, no matter what, in any way, so that you'll never be in a position to say that I was made better off because of you. Now, does that sound like a positive conversation? No. So it'd be like you guys saying, hey, actually, let's turn it around. I'd say, hey, I want to donate to your cause because I think it's a worthy cause. And you said, you know what? We're not interested in anything anything that comes from your hands. That's what Abraham said. I'm not interested in anything that comes from you. He didn't say I'm not interested in anything that comes from anybody. He took the goods from the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh. He took it from, I forget who the other community is, where he had the same situation the second time, and he took more goods from that. He didn't have a problem gaining on the, from other people, but not Sodom. He wanted to make real clear, and the king of Sodom knew this, right? This was the ultimate face down. He said, I don't want anything from you. I only held on to it so I could tell you that I don't want anything from you, just so we're real clear, right? So take your stuff, take my nephew, get out of here. So there has to be, and I didn't go through that the first time, but there has to be a real sensitivity to the garbage that's happening in Sodom. And Lot has gone from living near Sodom to living in Sodom. And you got to wonder what is going on in the story. Now, and I'm going to allude, now we're going to go back to the story where Abram's talking to the angels. And the angel's like, we're going to go down there and we're going to destroy it. If it's really as wicked as the rumor has it, we're going to destroy it. And what does Abraham do? Really peculiar.
He tries to get them not to do that.
Yeah, doesn't he say, wow, would God really do something wrong? Far be it from God to not do what is right. If there's someone righteous in the town, would you destroy the righteous with the evil? And that's his starting conversation point. And it's an interesting conversation, right? Because you're going to destroy the evil people for the evil. What are you going to do with the righteous people in the town? Who might be righteous in the town?
Lot's family.
Oh, right. And so we know that Abraham has one family in mind. As a matter of fact, we know the angels reveal this to Abraham not because the city is going to be destroyed, but because Lot's in the city. It's possible that it's possible that many cities were destroyed at different times by God because of the evil in them. We just don't know. But the reason this conversation happens with Abraham is because God loves Abraham, and Abraham loves
God.
whom?
Lot.
Yeah, Lot. Right? Yeah. So that's what the whole conversation is, on the basis of Abraham having the promises and the fact that he's going to raise his children in truth. Should we hold this from him, or should we tell him what's going to happen? And they decided we're going to tell him what's going to happen. And it's an interesting story. So he negotiates from 50 to 40 to 30 to 20 to 10. But he stops at 10. Is 10 righteous more important? I said that wrong. Are 10 righteous people more important than one righteous person in the eyes of God?
No.
The answer is no. Right? God doesn't love 10 people. He loves every person, one person at a time. The conversation with Abraham could easily have been, if there's anyone in the city that's righteous, will you not make sure they're protected? So why does he count down?
Perhaps because there were 50 people in Lot's extended family that were living inside the city.
50.
Yeah. That's where I am. He starts with 50 because in the extended household of Lot, he had servants and shepherds and everything else. And if Lot is training his house like he should be, then there would be about 50 righteous people. But it's interesting then that Abraham starts to count them down, right? What if there's just 40? What if there's 30? What if a few have fallen away? What if there's 20? What if most of his servants, have actually fallen to the greed and the evil of the city? But what if there's only 10? So what would you think would be the one place where you would count on a religious leader in the family to tightly focus?
Your children.
Yeah. Your children, your wife, right? My shepherds, my servants, my extended, servants' families, they're going to be under the coverage of my teaching. But if I'm going to be spending lots of extra time and focus and, energy, it's going to be my daughters, my sons, my wife. This is my nucleus, right? And it's interesting that Abraham starts. Now, I will tell you, this is my speculation. But my speculation for the number 10 is that Abraham knew that the immediate family was 10. And we know that Abraham, he was kept from having children so that when he did have children, it would be seen as the result of the promises. But you don't see any indication of that from Lot. And he was with Abraham for a long time. So whether it's children and children or grandchildren, whatever the case might be, what I suspect is that Lot had 10 people in his nucleus, in the nuclear family. And it's interesting because what happens is they agree that if there's only 10, right? If there's only 10, we will not destroy the city. And then they go down to the city, and we know the story. Lot is in the square, and he's looking for visitors to the city. He sees these men. They say, "No, we're going to stay in the square." He says, "No, you're not." And it seems like there's a discussion about this, but Lot persists. He will not let visitors stay in the open because he knows what's going on. So Lot gets the 2 men into his house. Don't know that he knows that they're angels, right? Just treats them like men. And it says, all the men of the town. All the men of the town came. Now we're going to look at a couple things here real quick because this is important. Let's see. We're at Genesis 19, verse 4. And we'll look at that, and I just want to ask you the question: who does it say arrived at the door in Genesis 19, verse 4?
The men of the city.
Yeah. Does it say some of the men of the city?
Says,
all of them.
well, no, it doesn't say it. It just says the men of the city.
The men of the city. The young and the old, all the people.
Okay, yeah.
Different versions might read it differently, but the emphasis is that the men of the city came to the door, right? And you're going to see something very interesting. You ever wonder about the passage where it talks about Lot being prepared to give up his daughters?
Yeah.
And think that that's really peculiar? And I'm going to share with you that it's really peculiar until you see some of the details, right? Because when you put it together, it makes a great deal of sense because you see what Lot's trying to accomplish. And at face value, it's not what you think it is. Well, it may be what you think it is, but so we're going to look at this. The men of the city, the men of Sodom, surrounded the home. They're not going to let these guys get out, right? And they're looking at having sex with these men. They're going to abuse them because these men certainly don't want, right? They don't want the angels don't want that to happen. So the men, this is a great wickedness. And they called Lot, and he, he says, where are these guys that have come here for the evening, right? Where are they? Bring them out to us so that we may have relations with them, so that we can have sex with them. And so they're going to abuse them, but it's all the men. So here's the thing. We know that Lot then offers the daughters, but I want you to follow me to verse 12. So it's chapter 19, verse 12. And the 2 men said to Lot, who else is here? Do you have sons?
Who else here?
Do you have sons? Do you have son-in-laws? Do you have daughters? Right? And it's an interesting question because what we find is in the household with Lot are his wife and his 2 daughters. Right? But his 2 daughters have what?
Husbands.
Yeah, they have. It's the son-in-laws or the potential son-in-laws for the women. So Lot's going to go out and talk to the son-in-laws. Let me ask you a question. Where's he going to go out and talk to the son-in-laws?
Among all the men that were at the door.
Uh-huh. So the either the husbands or prospective husbands of the 2 daughters are outside with the men, wanting to have sex with the 2 men that were inside. So here's the conversation with Lot. He's like, take my daughters instead. Now, let me ask you a question. If he sends his daughters out, what's going to happen?
Well, the to-be husbands will almost protect her, right?
More than that, the city, those two men or the husbands are probably related to the other men. They're all family. Right? And if you think about what Lot's trying to accomplish, he's trying to disarm the whole conversation. He's saying if what you really want is to have perverse relations, well, take the two girls who are already engaged or married to your family, the men in your family. And he knows that the husbands are gonna want to defend they're not gonna want to share their wives with the whole community. Right? So I think he's trying to find a creative way to bring them to their senses. And what happens instead is all the men, including the son-in-law potentials, say, no, not interested. Now, here's another thing for you, is that if his family is 10, if the core of his family is 10, then we have 4 people accounted for. And in my thinking, he moves his family down near Sodom. There are people in Sodom. His children are of age. They meet prospective wives or prospective husbands. They become integrated into the community. Lot's vexed by the evil of the community, so what does he choose to do?
I don't know.
Well, think about it. If your children are in the community and the community is evil, what would be your natural inclination as a parent?
Take them out.
Yeah, you can't leave and solve the problem with your kids. You actually need to move closer to your children so that you can have an influence on what's happening and what's going on in their lives. Does that make sense? So I don't think that Lot necessarily wanted to live in Sodom, but I suspect that his children got drawn in, and when they did, it means he had to get closer too. And we know that there's a comment in the New Testament about that righteous Lot was vexed by the evil of the community he was in. He didn't go there because he enjoyed the evil. He went there for some other reason. And I think my own guessing with the way the angels are talking to him is like, if you've got sons and daughters and sons-in-laws and whatever family you have, go to them and tell them that we need to leave. And I think it's suggestive that he has more family, and that some of that family is out there with the men, including the son-in-laws. And he doesn't go any further than that because he already knows that they're lost. Now, this also brings up another conversation, right? Because later they actually leave the town and they go to Zoar, which is a small town, a little town that's not far outside of Sodom. And when they do, at some point, his wife turns around and looks back at the city, right? Now, I've heard all sorts of different conversations about this. She missed the shopping, she missed the culture, and I don't think that's what's going on. I actually think that she knows she's losing her son-in-laws and that she has extended family that are there. And they didn't leave voluntarily, right? You know that the two men, the angels, took Lot by the arms and drew him out of the city. He didn't leave on his own. They drew him out, right? And that's in the story. But I think it's suggestive that he didn't want to leave. It's not that he didn't want to leave the place of evil. It's that he had something there he didn't want to abandon. And I think that's what's going on with Lot's wife. What's happened with her is she turned around and looked. She longed for what she was losing, and what she was losing was family. And to me, that's what's happening in the conversation. That's the reason the story unfolds the way it does, is because they were making a real sacrifice to leave. And there's a deeper story in this. So it's interesting because two things that I always thought were real curious. The offering of the daughters was not because women were cheap and better than having men be abused. It was because their husbands or prospective husbands were in the crowd, and he knew that any self-respecting husband would make sure that his wife was properly cared for and would not allow his brothers and cousins and nephews to abuse his wife. and he was trying to undermine the circle or the situation that was coming up by drawing his son-in-laws into a better conversation, drawing them into a conversation where they would have to stand against their own family. So remember, one of the comments about Lot by the people of the town is, he came to us as an alien, and now he's presuming to be judge over us. So if he can get one of the people who's actually in the family of the town to stand up for what's right, then he has an ally in the town, and not an alien himself, but someone inside who can seek to make a difference. So you get that conversation happening, and then you get the whole thing about his wife turning around because she longed for something in the city. And they were told not to turn around. They were told, right? So it must have been something really important. And I think the evidence stacks up to tell us that his children were in the city. A lot of his children were in the city. So, so we have it's interesting. Lot tells the angels that he can't make it to the mountains, that he just can't make it there. But we were told a little later on that he was afraid to stay in Zoar, and so he and his two daughters left and went to the mountains. Now, this is, to me, very, very, very peculiar, right? And can you think of any reason that or anything that might be peculiar about Lot actually requesting of the angels that he be taken to Zoar and then eventually going to the mountains?
Well, I'm just wondering if he left Zor because the people of Zor got angry and figured that he was the cause of the destruction for Sodom and Gomorrah, and they were out to get him.
You know, at the very least, they'd be afraid of him because if you know, as the sole survivor, it'd be a question: is he bad luck, or might we also come under the same judgment? I mean, the fact of the matter is, the scripture makes it clear that Zoar would have been destroyed had Lot not asked to go there, which makes me wonder if one of his kids was maybe there. But I don't know why he wouldn't then have left with his kids or stayed in town. But it says that he's afraid, and so maybe there's, you know, maybe they're superstitious and they're just terrified. Kind of draws my mind to you know, Legion, and after the pigs went into the water, the town people were terrified of Legion, and you know, you kind of get the same thing with superstitious people, that they don't want any part of anybody that's associated in any way with the destruction of all the towns in the valley, right? And so he realizes he's not in the best place. Let me offer something. Who would be the spiritual leader of Lot? Abraham, right?
Yeah, that was
if Lot.
Yeah,
Abraham. So if Lot has lived in the presence of Abraham, been raised spiritually by Abraham, he lived in this city of evil and perversity, the city's destroyed, and Lot's going to go to
mountain. Abraham.
Yeah. What's up? What's up with Lot? I mean, there's a verse that says he was vexed by the evil in the city, but when he no longer has herds, he no longer has wealth, he no longer has much of a family, and instead of going to Abraham, he goes and finds a cave in the mountains to isolate himself and his family away from everybody else in the world. What's up with Lot? Right? And there's another part of this story that's interesting, and that's that Abraham had asked of the angels that if there only be 10 people, that they not destroy the city. And the next morning, Abraham goes out on the hill and looks down over the valley. Before I go any further than that, I'm like, where is Abraham? So this has been quite some time, right? This isn't just a few weeks after they parted ways. This has been years. So Abraham is still in eyeshot over the crest of a hill the well-watered valley, and it's probably a large place, but he's not far off. He never went to, he said, you go to the right, I'll go to the left. He never went to the left. He stayed. He didn't actually separate from Lot. He stayed close by. He let Lot go down to the valley, but he stayed close by. And in the morning he goes and he sees that the town is destroyed. And does he go to the town to search to see if he can find his nephew?
No.
No, he doesn't. It says he saw that this pillar of the dark pillar coming out of the valley, and he knew that the valley was destroyed. Basically he knew it was destroyed. So he knew there weren't 10, and he packed up his house and he moved away. He packed up his house and moved away. So this is where I would like to stop, and then I'd like to draw out a couple of conversations, because we know then that within a year of this day that Isaac was born. So we know that when Isaac is born, he has successfully left his country, he's successfully left his family, and he's allowed God to draw his path. And when those three things all happen, when those three things are all true, about 30 years after the promise and the instruction was given to him, 30 years later, when all three of those things are checked off, is when his child is born, and the beginning of the descendants that would fill the earth, like the sand on the seashore, or like if you could count the dust, then you could count your children. The first child of that promise was born when Abraham is between 99 and 100 years old. Right? The child of promise didn't happen until about 30 years after God's first interaction and instruction to Abraham. And if you follow me, he waited for 30 years for Abraham to finally get to the point where he did all the three things that he was asked to do. And he was patient with Abraham for the entire time. But also, God is going to keep his promise, but not until all of the criteria are met. There's a 2 Peter conversation that says he's not slow in keeping his promise, as some reckon, or some understand slowness, right? But he's waiting for the fullness of time to be filled. He's waiting for all of the things that must first come to pass before he does finally finish his promise. Now, I don't want to go too much longer now. I want to wrap up the discussion of the class and say, so the first part is this, that God is going to speak to us. He's going to lead us, and we're going to know, or we're going to think, we're going to feel. We'll pray, and God will we'll start getting this awareness that there are things that we should do and things we shouldn't do, and God is leading us. Whether it's overtly, like speaking in a voice to you, or usually far more subtly, where you want to go a certain direction and all the doors close, all the opportunities fall away, and you want to go another direction and everything just suddenly happens and it all just works, and it's all good. God works and interacts with us in different ways, and it's always the battle of being sensitive and to being thoughtful and to listening to the different influences in our life, and reading and praying and meditating and seeking counsel from brothers and sisters, people that we trust have a spiritual mindset, to kind of lead us in the right directions. But things just don't happen. It takes time. It takes development. And God will work with us, to take us where we need to go, but we have to be prepared and willing to be patient and to listen to him and to follow him. And that's a lot of the conversation that we have right here about how God works with man, and about how, there are things we have to do to follow God, to listen to him and follow him, for God to continue to fulfill, the things in our life that will take us where we need to go. And you see that in Abraham. And it doesn't just happen, right? Sometimes just happen can happen. But But it doesn't just happen. As a rule, it's a life work of listening to God and seeking to follow God and taking the next step. And that's okay. That's how it works. That's how God works with us. Now, the last story in the conclusion, actually, of Lot, and I'll share with you what I see in Lot. So I see in Lot that instead of being God-driven, he's looking at the physical, right? He's saying, well, it's a well-watered garden. It'll lead to greater growth. It'll lead to, the things I'm checking off in my list of what I want, and it doesn't work for him, right? It doesn't work for him because the premise Lot has is, how can I be enriched faster and better, and what are my conditions that I need to be better off in the end, and just taking control of his own destiny. And what he does is he evaluates the physical benefit before he evaluates the spiritual. And I hope you can see that in the story, because he looks at it, and what he says is it's a well-watered garden. Abraham has already identified that Sodom is not a character that he wants to be associated with in any way. Lot's in his house, and when Lot chooses where he's going to live, he looks at the quality of the place and ignores the character of the people. And the character of the people are what undoes Lot. And so what it shows you is he takes a physical first approach. And the outcome is, because he takes a physical first approach and doesn't take a spiritual first approach, is that his spiritual life is destroyed. His physical family is destroyed. His future hope, at least in the physical sense, is destroyed. And I want to point out one last thing. Y'all have heard the story about how both the daughters of Lot wanted to have children, and so they individually got their father drunk and then got pregnant through their dad. Is that like perverse, or am I the only one that thinks that's weird?
That's disgusting.
It's disgusting. Yeah, it's disgusting. You're sure right. And you know who their children were?
Moab.
One of them is Ben-Ami. Ben-Ami and Ami are the Ammonites, and the Ammonites became the enemies of Israel. And the other one is Moab, and Moabites became the enemies of Israel. It's interesting that in the land of promise, two of the greatest enemies of Israel were the offspring of Lot, who lived in the tents of Abraham, the father of righteousness. The decisions he made weren't just decisions he was making for himself. They were decisions he was making for his whole family. Now, I started off with the premise that every story you read in the Bible, the reason it's there is because it leads us in our conversation about the master plan of God, that God wants us to be part of his family. And in this particular story, we see a contrast of two realities. You seek in your life to be led in spiritual ways, and God develops you over a period of time. And what happens is you develop a spiritual family, and you let God take care of your physical outcomes, and he will. Alternatively, you can decide that you're going to take care of your physical wants and put God second. And what will happen is you may or may not end up with your physical wants that you received, but it will undo you spiritually when you take control of your own destiny, as it were. God lets you, and when that happens, you end up walking away from God, because he won't be second. He's either first or he's not. Right? And that's the story here. That's the contrast. You have the story of one who's listening intentionally and intelligently to God's leadership in his life, and another person who's looking at physical benefit, at the well-watered garden, choosing his own path, choosing his own way. And I think the reason he didn't return to Abraham is because once you start down that path, it's difficult to return to the spiritual path. And he'd be both embarrassed, as well as he may actually have bought into the idea that he could control the outcomes in his life. And that made it that would make it almost impossible to live in the house of a person who's waiting for the Lord over the course of the next 5 or 10 years to show him where he should be going. They had a real parting of ways, and it just wasn't just where they lived. And the outcome are either the children of faith or the enemies of the children of faith. And that's the instruction that we have. So we have to know how we want to decide our life path should go. I want to give mine to God. So as for you, what I would have you take out of this lesson is place your life in the hands of God. Listen to him for his guidance and counsel. Let him take you where you need to go, and you will receive the promises, promises through the Spirit. And that's the lesson I see here. Does that make sense?
Perfect sense. Do you think Lot, why does Peter say that it was righteous Lot then? I mean, do you think Lot fell away from loving God, or is he called righteous because he actually was righteous?
Well, and so the answer to that is yes. I certainly wouldn't pass a judgment on Lot as an individual, because you can end up in some pretty bad ways and still have the right heart for God, and we see that in other places in the Scriptures. We take the object lesson from his life. If he were given it, there's another way of saying something there. Sometimes you got to cut your losses. My strong speculation, or the speculation that I feel very strongly about, is that what drew Lot into that circumstance was that once his family were tied in, he couldn't escape. And once the dominoes started to fall, he got deeper and deeper, entrenched, because I think he was a righteous man, and I think the evil of the city vexed him. I think it hurt him. It was painful to him. But if he were going to leave, he was going to end up losing family. But the problem with pervasive evil is that the more you're around it, the worse it will affect you, and the worse it will affect your family. And so there may have been a time where there was, a son that was stuck, and he got closer because he wanted to help the son. But then his daughter married someone in the community. Now he's got 2 that are in. And then another son was drawn into the community. And before you know it, even his other 2 daughters are engaged to men who are also engaged in perverse activities. He probably got closer to the city to try to influence his children that were going the wrong way, but what ended up happening is he lost them all, because he didn't know that he had to put God first, and he had to be prepared to walk away. And sometimes that's where God places us. Who are you going to put first? Because in the Gospels it tells us that the one who puts away father and mother and puts God first, he says that will be the one that will be blessed. And it's kind of like that's the lesson of Lot. I mean, I don't know if that answers your question, because I don't know if Peter's saying he was there was a period of time in his life where he was vexed by the wickedness and he was righteous then, or if Peter's saying that Lot was a righteous man and it was really vexing when he was still in the city, right? But the problem is, I think it's disgusting that his daughters went up to him, but consider that his daughters were raised for a significant period of their life in Sodom. They probably never thought twice about doing that. It tells you something about the culture of Sodom. I mean, if the men are prepared to have, citywide sex with strangers coming into town, daughters and dads and everything may have been a go. I mean, it may have all been, fair game in that city. So the daughters are thinking, well, how are we going to have kids? Well, obviously, we're going to have sex with dad. And it shows that if you get too close to the sun, right, you're going to get
burned.
That's right. If you decide to live in the middle of the city of Sodom, instead of solving the problem of your children falling away, what's going to happen is you're going to lose your entire family. And he paid the price. But part of that is to us as well. Learn the lesson of Lot. You can't solve the perversion. You've got to go after it a different way. And Abraham, lived in the cold, he lived in the surrounding area, and it doesn't seem like he was affected by that. And that's because he took a different approach. He took a different tack. And so one of two things. You're either going to learn the tack or you're going to find yourself in a bad way. But if you find yourself in a bad way, you can still return to God, but you've got to be prepared to cut your losses. It just is what it is. And I think that's the underlying story that we see with Abraham and Lot. And Lot didn't know how to cut his losses, and because of that, he lost everything. Even to the point where his children became enemies of the very family that he had lived in, the spiritual family he had lived with. So that's instructional for us, because that keeping our eye on that helps us to understand one of the elements of our life choices that will lead us into the kingdom, as well as guidance if we find ourselves in a bad way. Cut your losses, turn back to God, get straight, and God will sort out the rest. He will sort it out. But they're just things that we can't fix.
Yeah, all right. Well, thank you. That was neat. I've never thought of the promises like that. Sorry. So, if you want to say a prayer to close, then we'll finish up here.
Absolutely. You want me to say it?
Yes, please.
Yes, pleasure. Father, we just come before you at this time, and we praise you great in your holy name. We know that you know the ways that we should go, and we place our lives in your hand. We ask that you give us strength and courage to trust, and the patience to wait on your will. We ask that you would show us. And I know for me personally, sometimes I'm kind of slow. If you just make it clear for me that there's a path you want me to follow, and that you give me the strength and courage to follow it. I ask and pray the same thing for every person that's in this Bible study, that you would work with them and that you'd make clear to them their role and their path, and that you give each and every person the strength to follow you and to follow that path, and to be patient until it's revealed, and that you'd bless them in due time. And we know that this is a developmental process. This life is developmental. We know that the real promise is in the kingdom. We ask that you bring every single person that's in our study tonight, and that in our studies as we go, that you bring every one of them into your kingdom, and that they all have the opportunity to bring you praise, glory, and honor through all time. We ask and we pray all of these things, and thankfulness for the opportunity we have to consider your word, and that it would be useful and beneficial to each person as they continue to go through it and chew on it and make it part of their life. And ask all these things, Jesus, in your name. Amen.
All right. Well, that was great. Yeah, thank you very, very much.
No, it's my pleasure. My pleasure. I think an hour and a half is my time, no matter what I do. But I hope it's useful for you.
Yeah. So is next week, that's your last class, correct?
That is my last class in this series, yes.
All right. So we will look forward to that. Enjoy the Home Alone tonight. Yeah, sorry to hear about your father-in-law. That's terrible.
Yeah, I appreciate it. But let me just give a word of hope. First of all, he's a believer, right? He has the hope. I'm going to see him again, and as things are going right now, it may not be very long. So, and I know that his next breath will be in the presence of Jesus, right?
Yep.
So, yeah. The problem is I'm going to miss him until we're all rejoined. But I would say the other thing is he was 85. He lived a good life, and it was time, and it wasn't a surprise. It wasn't a 16-year-old kid in a car wreck or something.
Yeah.
Praise God. Yeah, take him at his time.
Yeah, doesn't make it easy, but it's still comforting.
Yeah, that's the way it goes, right? That's the way it's supposed to go. So anyway, yeah, I appreciate it.